All right. Welcome again. We're feeling the remainders of the afternoon warmth on the building. It cools off fairly quickly, but I think we'll be okay. And if you're not, I can always fire up that propane heater, which has a heck of a roar, but it warms up really fast. So welcome to Swallowfield Farm. My name is Dennis DeGroot, and this is my wife, Jenny, and we're really happy to host you here. And we like to recognize that we have close neighbors, the Kwantlen people, and that we are on the unceded territories of the Kwantlen, the Katzie, the Matsqui, and the Semiahmoo First Nations, and that we want to recognize that that's a complicated history, and we need to sort out a lot of things. I'm going to put in a little plug. I'm on a committee that has an annual walk for reconciliation with residential school survivors, and that's coming up right at the end of the month. We're an interfaith group, and we try to walk over you can walk one day, you can walk 2 days, 3 days. We walk from Fort Langley to Mission, to what used to be a residential school in Mission, St. Mary's. And the walk is growing every year, and sadly, in some ways, it really took a jump last year, because will be the 1 year anniversary of the discovery of the unmarked graves in Kamloops. And the good side of it is it's increasing people's awareness and hopefully also participation in the important work of reconciliation that we need to do. I'd like to read a piece by Wendell Berry, who I think he will be sainted, I'm sure, at some point. If not, he should be. So I'm having a hard time holding this book, and Wendell Berry says, "We have been wrong. We must change our lives so that it will be possible to live by the contrary assumption that what is good for the world will be good for us. And that requires that we make the effort to know the world and to learn what is good for it. We must learn to cooperate in its processes and to yield to its limits. But even more important, we must learn to acknowledge that the creation is full of mystery. We will never entirely understand it. We must abandon arrogance and stand in awe. We must recover the sense of the majesty of creation and the ability to be worshipful in its presence. For I do not doubt that it is only on the condition of humility and reverence before the world that our species will be able to remain in it."
So I am going to do Betty's job. This is something that she would do if she was here, but she hasn't been able to come out today. And that's introduce our two presenters. They are both presenters. I'm first going to introduce Sarah Ronald, and she has put her projection downstairs. Have we all seen it? Did we all come in and see her projection on the sheet? If not, it'll be dark by the time we're over. And it ties into creation for sure. Wolves and things. Coyotes. Even more appropriate for here, because we do have coyotes. And also, it's interesting, Betty has been saying about this art installation that she usually has multimedia, so audio and different things happening. And this is her first show installation where she doesn't have that. So it's kind of neat that you're adding that little element to it. So why don't you come up here and say a few things, and then after that I'll introduce Jason.
Ooh, microphones. Hi, I'm Sarah. I will keep it brief. I've got my art installation downstairs projected for the evening. I'll be back again, I believe, on Friday, Saturday next week as well. The animation is actually basically a flip book, and it's 100 different drawings to create the animation, and then it was each scanned and compiled into a digital slideshow that you'll see down there that just looks like a flowing coyote coming and going from the scene. And it's called Encounter, the original, and when I install it out in the community, I call it Encounter. So you're encountering the coyote, and so this project is something that I'm expanding across the Lower Mainland and presenting at a variety of different locations, and it's really about our spotting the wildlife that we share the space with, and sometimes you may see it and sometimes you don't, and it's a flash in the corner of your eye and then gone. So it's something that I'm working on and adding more animals to. If you've got any questions, feel free to ask. I'll be downstairs after. So that's me. Thanks.
Thank you. All right. And it is my pleasure to introduce Jason. Jason is a professor at Vancouver School of Theology. You're not a professor in creation care, or you are, because everything is creation care.
Yeah, no,
I
teach preaching.
Yes. He teaches preaching. I love that. Which is creation care, of course. All our pastors preach about creation care. No, I lost my train of thought. So Jason was here last week, and it was very good to hear him. And it was a completely different topic than this, so I'm looking forward to this. But when I saw Jason's name, I was like, how do I know this person? And then I realized it was because I'd been on a talk through A Rocha, which we've always been quite involved with A Rocha all these years. But he was introducing and chatting with somebody named Carmody Gray, who is a Catholic theologian, but she's also very much about creation care. And it's worth looking up because when I listened to her, it was like my worldview. It was like, that's what I believe about God and the world and the Bible and everything. So my guess is that's a little bit of what we're going to hear from you as well.
Could be.
So, welcome, Jason.
Thank you. Good to be back with you. I think I recognize some of you from the other day, but most not. So I won't assume that you've heard from me before. I am on the board of Arocha Canada. I have in mind more to talk about biblical interpretation, but you'll see how it applies to Arocha, I think. The connections should be clear. So one question from our times together, I think, is how do you interpret the Bible if you're not going to treat it as a bad science textbook, right? Like, how do you read the Bible biblically? So some of this will build on what David Goa said this afternoon. The good news, I think, is that the church never read the Bible that poorly until about the year 1900. So we have lots of good resources to read the Bible well before modern fundamentalism. So I do teach preaching. Someone has to do it. I try to practice what I preach. And I think the key thing is helping students know how to approach the Bible as a kind of friend. I think they have a variety of reasons to think of the Bible as a kind of problem, and that's not good enough, or at least it doesn't make for very interesting preaching. One of the problems they know to address from their Bible classes is the relationship between what's in the Bible and history, like what really happened, right? So if you're a more liberal seminary like ours, you sit kind of loose with history questions, like, we tend to think not that much is that accurate. But if you're at a more conservative seminary, you tend to think, you better say all this stuff happened or you're bad, and like the church falls apart or something. That's just not the question I'm asking, because I don't care. I'm asking, how is Christ saving us now? And how is that reflected in the words on the page? That's the kind of thing I'm trying to get at. Now, I care about history a little, and I tend to trust the scriptures and have a high regard for their historicity. I care about modern approaches to the Bible and their skepticism a little. That's kind of fun, like in a board game kind of way. Here's what I really care about. The God of the cosmos is transfiguring everything right now and making it new. Now, how do these words in the scriptures bear witness to what God is doing right now? That's the payoff, I think. If you like, I try and teach preachers to speak of God with present tense verbs. God is, not a long time ago, far, far away, some really weird people wrote down a really bad, shut up, I'm already bored, right? Like, no. Jesus now is doing the following. Now you got a sermon on your hands, okay? I think this is really an artist's way of seeing, and I think you can correct me on this. When I go to museums, I'm amazed today at their technical wizardry, right? They got like infrared images that show you, well, originally Leonardo put her arm here, but now in the final version, her arm is like over here. And I think, that's kind of cool. But what they can't tell me is like, well, why did they paint her? Like, why did so many artists think the Blessed Virgin Mary was the most beautiful person that you could depict? They're not very good at explaining that part. Now, they're pretty good at saying, well, the church was the patron and the church paid the bills, and so artists painted churchly things. And there's truth in that, but that's not the only truth there is. So, for example, Michelangelo's famous Pietà, I'll go with kind of a layup example here. This is the dead Christ in Mary's lap. When I despair over humanity, sometimes I stop and think, okay, I belong to the race of creatures that produce that. So, like, maybe it's not all bad. Now, there's science in this. How did Michelangelo get a grown man in a grown woman's lap without it looking silly, proportionally? Like, that's a mathematical kind of question. The answer is he twisted Jesus' body around Mary. So from our vantage point, it looks quite natural. Most of these images don't look natural. It's really hard to put a grown person in another grown person's lap and have it look natural. Here, it looks like the most peaceful thing there's ever been, right? There's also godlike skill there. How do you make marble do that? But there's also stuff you can't quantify, right? So T.S. Eliot dated his conversion to standing in front of that sculpture, dropping to his knees, he knew not why, and saying, I'm going to follow Jesus the rest of my life. Now, I feel like if you're not responding in that key, you're not really getting it, right? I want sermons to do that. They won't all do that. Not all sculptures do that, not by a long shot. Here's what I don't want. Allison, are you listening? She's one of our students. Like, you're getting a little preview of coming preaching class. I don't want sermons that say, hey, that's not in the Bible, or that didn't happen. I don't care. And I don't want sermons that belabor, well, here's how you hold a chisel and how hard you have to. Like, okay, fine, that's a course on sculpting. That's a good thing, but that's not what I'm talking about. Snore. I want sermons that recognize God has done something here. Something's loose in the world with this piece of art. Now, preach in a way that moves me like that. Now, this is a little romantic, more than a little romantic, I grant, but churches aren't dying for excessive romanticism, I think. Two early church images guide my way of reading the Bible like this. One of them comes from Origen. So Origen was condemned for a long time in the church as a kind of arch heretic. But he's been recognized in the 20th century as like the leading saint and theologian he was. He's from 3rd century North Africa, Alexandria. And he compares reading the Bible to being a physician. Now, we would call what he means being an herbal healer, okay? So to be a good herbal healer, you have to know everything that's in the garden. Absolutely every, I say herb. I did this whole thing in Britain where they want you to say herb, and they had no idea what I was saying. This is British Columbia. Y'all understand what a herb is? Okay. All right. So you got to know what all the herbs do, and you got to know what they do in combination with all the other ones. Okay? You got to know that this one, if you grind it up with this one in a pestle, it'll heal this kind of ailment. Right? But you also got to know that this one, if you grind it up with this one, that'll blow up. Don't do that. But if you grind it up with this one, it'll, right. So it works because you got to not just know the like vegetables. You got to be able to read the patient. You got to be able to say, okay, this is what's ailing this person. This is what's really wrong. Here's what they think's wrong. They're mistaken. Here's how they get well. Origen says the Bible's like that. To interpret the Bible, you have to know every herb, every verse, every single thing, every one that seems important, every one that seems not important. And then you got to know what they do in combination with one another. So if you take a little Exodus and you grind it up with a little Revelation, wait, don't do that, it'll blow up. But if you take a little Exodus and you grind it up with a little Ruth, it'll heal this kind of patient. The reason I love it is because you can tell whether you did it right. They get well. If they don't get well, but you did it factually correctly, no one should care. The payoff of reading the Bible is the health of the person in front of you. Now, nearby here, you've got an example of this. This is a primitive physic transplanted from Cambridge in the UK to UBC's Botanical Garden. And it says what each of these things do. There's nightshade in there. It'll lower your blood pressure if it doesn't kill you. You got to know how much to give somebody, right? Lots of our medicine is not so synthetic as to not depend on stuff coming out of the ground. We're just better herbal healers sometimes. All right. Origen adds this. It has to be beautiful. Now, doctors I know would agree. How many times have you heard a doctor look at a wound and say, that's a nice stitch in that wound right there, right? That's an aesthetic judgment. And it partly has to do with the wound and its healing and how big a scar it's going to leave and so on. But I think artists want to do it beautifully, right? I'm right about that, right? Depends. If you want to do it uglily, you want it to be beautifully ugly. Anyway. Okay. For discussion later. All right. Second image for me comes from St. Augustine. And I mentioned this the other day, but most of y'all weren't here the other day. It's about delight. So Augustine has this preacher. This is another North African 4th and 5th century bishop. And he has this preacher who writes him this heartbreaking letter. This preacher says, when I preach, I'm bored, and they're bored, and I can tell, and they can tell, and it's awful. Like, what do I do? And Augustine says, well, I can send you a textbook, on rhetoric or something, but that's not really it. Here's what you need to do. You need to notice that, they'll notice what delights you. It doesn't mean they'll be delighted by what delights you. They'll notice it, okay? So as a preacher, you have to aim your delight at Jesus Christ and the new world he's birthing, right in the middle of the old one. So the example I used the other day, I had a preacher that I sat under for a while who loved his, private plane. And his sermons would go on about how cool flying was. And then he'd almost be out of time, and he'd be like, well, I guess I should say something with the Bible or something before we get done. Dude, time for a new line of work, right? So I noticed what delighted him, and it bored me. I don't care. So as a preacher, you have to tune your delight toward Christ and the way he's being depicted in the scriptures. Augustine says this to his church at one point. I love this aside. He says, I'm feeding you with what I'm feeding on myself. I'm feeding you what I'm feeding on myself. I like to eat in restaurants where it looks like the cook likes to eat, right? And wants to eat there, not the place next door. Okay. So to use another word in the church's treasury, I talk a lot about reading the Bible allegorically, okay? So this just means reading it in some sense other than the literal. It suggests that there's a literal way the Bible speaks, and that's good. There's also a deeper sense that the Bible speaks. That's all allegory means, is another sense or a deeper sense. You'll see other descriptions of this, sometimes figural reading, sometimes spiritual reading. I don't care what we call it. Some way of reading that's not limited to the obvious or the historical. So in the medieval church, they described 4 levels of meaning. This is often called the quadriga for 4. So I want to go through these because I actually think they're helpful. A first level of reading is the literal sense. So the example is the city of Jerusalem, which you see there in nighttime. It's a city. You can go there. There's shawarma stands and TV repair shops. It's a place where people live. It has a postal code. It's not a make-believe place. It's a real-life place, right? In the same glorious, real-life, troubling way that every place is a real-life place. When we're talking about the Bible, the literal sense, I think, does not mean what actually happened. It's not to be discovered underneath or behind the letter. The literal sense is the way the words go. What's it saying, right? What's patent on the page? Now, sometimes for Christians, the literal sense, even of the Old Testament, refers to Jesus. They think that's literal, okay? So you got to be careful with the literal sense. It's a stretchy thing. It's not an obvious thing. It's a difficult thing. It's a wild animal, as it were, okay? And then the church said you want to read also allegorically. That is what the church believes about God from this passage, okay? So in the church, again, this often means that it's a reading that has to do with Jesus. How is Jesus being referred to in this passage? So, for example, the Song of Songs, this wonderful love ballad in the Old Testament, rabbis for centuries before the church read it as a love song between God and Israel. Now, I absolutely love this. There needs to be a book in the Bible where all God says is, I love you, And all Israel says back is, I love you too. Now, even reading in the literal sense, the Song of Songs is difficult. The lovers are separated from one another. They get jumped and beat up in a couple of places. They're looking for each other and they can't find each other. Anyone who's ever been in love knows that that's what it's like. It's not pure, unending up and up, right? There's interruptions, there's difficulties, there's misinterpretations. It just feels like real life to me in that way. So the church took that reading and said, yeah, and in the same way, it's a description of Christ's stormy love affair with the church, right? And the book reminds us to keep saying, I love you, even if we don't entirely mean it in the moment, okay? So here, Jerusalem is not just a city with a postal code, it's also the body of Christ, the church, head and members. Everyone who believes in him is part of that body. That's Jerusalem. Now, I'm saying all this because Jerusalem comes up a lot in the Psalms. So when Jerusalem comes up, sometimes it means the city that you can walk to. Sometimes it means Israel. It means God's people. Okay. Third sense. There's no test. All right. Third sense is a tropological sense. I say that because that's a 10-cent word if there ever was one. What this means is how to behave. So both insiders to Christian faith and outsiders often think this is what the Bible is mostly about. It's almost never about this. It's almost never being told, you should do the following, or you should not do the following. Yeah, there's some verses that are like that, but there are not very many, actually. So if we're thinking about the Psalms, the main tropology of the Psalms is praise the Lord. That's the thing to do. Offer praise, right? So the mood of the Psalms is more like a concert than it is like a kind of moralistic lecture where you're being told to behave with the shaking finger. But it also applies to difficult passages, and there are difficult passages in the Bible. David unpacked these brilliantly, I think, earlier today. So Psalm 137 praises whoever would pick up the Babylonians' babies and bash their heads against the rock. A tropological sense says, don't do that. We're against murdering small children. Well, okay, what's the text there for? A tropological sense says, here's what it's there for. Here's what it's actually trying to do. An example from C.S. Lewis, everybody with any kind of ego has a kind of whining voice in the back of our head that says, I'm really not recognized as much as I should be. I'm really better than that other person who's being recognized more than I'm really worth more money than this. I'm really better looking than they think. Right? Lewis says those are the little whining desires for a kind of egotistical promotion, and they should be destroyed before they can grow up. I think that's basically correct. A lot of what religious communities do is take problematic texts and figure out how to bend them back against themselves. Don't read it in that problematic way. An example, in the Islamic community, there's a lot of language of jihad. It's almost always moral struggle against oneself. That's what jihad means. Trying to be a decent person who loves other people. So what you do is you take texts that sound more violent than that, and you turn them against yourself as you try to become a decent, neighbor-loving human being, right? That's a tropological way of reading a biblical text or a Quranic text. So here, Jerusalem is the soul of the believer or the spiritual state of the church. I think this really matters to people. A lot of people who ditch Christianity are really worried about this. What about these terrible texts, and what do we do about them? A lot of preachers like me avoid the texts because they're not edifying. People didn't come to church to hear about bashing babies this morning, right? The problem with that strategy is they'll find them. They're in the book and they'll know about it. And if you don't tell them what to do with those texts, someone bad will tell them what to do with them, okay? So I try to teach my students, go into the scary place and come out with a hard-won blessing. I preached in Victoria one time, what I thought was a lovely sermon. And dude came out all red-faced. What about the bashing babies? Now, in one way I wanted to say, I wasn't talking about that this morning, sir. And another way, he's got a good point. Like, I owe him an explanation for what to do with that potentially radioactive text. Now, the danger of this is moralism, turning everything in the Bible into thou shalt or thou shalt not. Again, that's not a very common thing in the Bible, but churches like to play that card, and it's our worst face. So I'll give you an example. When I saw the coyotes downstairs, I thought of St. Francis. Francis is in Betty's artwork in a couple of places here. One of the many amazing things Francis did in the Middle Ages is he wandered off to the Middle East in the middle of the Crusades with no weapons and wandered across the battle line and asked for a meeting with the Sultan. What what made him think this was a good idea, right? He actually got malaria on that trip, and it probably killed him later on. And he had this meeting with the Sultan. And whatever they talked about, we don't know, but they exchanged gifts. If you go to Assisi, you can see the gifts that the Sultan gave Francis. Islamic historians depict that Sultan as having been too soft on Christians. So there's historical plausibility that this meeting actually took place and something edifying happened. Anyway, Francis comes back. And the main idea about the Holy Land in the Middle Ages is go there with weapons and conquer the place and take it back from the Muslims. That's the goal. Francis says, you know what we could do? We could totally celebrate the birth of Jesus in Bethlehem right here in Italy. Here's how we'll do it. We'll put together a little scene with some animals and some wise men and a little baby Jesus. He invented the creche scene. That little thing that churches and your neighbors and whatever put up around Christmas time, it looks like it's just sort of a sweet little, Pinterest thing, right? It was actually a clever way to divert war. It was Francis saying, let's worship the newborn king right here at our fireplace instead of going and killing for him. Isn't that good? All right, so you get my drift. Okay, fourth sense is called an anagogical sense of Scripture. It's not behaving. There we are. And it's reading in light of what we hope for ultimately. I actually think this is probably the best register on which Christians ought to engage non-Christians about the Bible. It's what I love about Rocha. Rocha is saying, you can take care of your watershed. You really can. And we're going to show you how to do it here at the Little Campbell River in South Surrey. That's a deeply hopeful thing to do, right? All right, so for Christians, what you hope for ultimately is the kingdom of God, the city of God, the world made the way God intends. So here when you see Jerusalem, it's a Jerusalem that's not yet. It's a Jerusalem that's coming. It's a city filled with nothing but perfect love of God and neighbor. The book of Revelation describes this city as a bride adorned for her husband coming down from heaven. In other words, you don't go away to heaven. Heaven comes here when Jesus comes on this view. So when you're talking about ultimate hope, it's really not a departure from this world to go to heaven. It's having heaven be crammed into earth. A baker asked John Calvin what they should do as a Christian baker, and he said, bake better bread. It's not a religious activity. It has to do with yeast and dough and things. It's this famous story about the building of Chartres Cathedral in, I don't know how to pronounce French, in France. And person comes up to the cathedral and passes workers, somebody who was a stonemason covered in dust, somebody who was glass blower covered in other sorts of dust, and gets there and there's someone sweeping the floor and says to this person, what are you doing? And they say, I'm building a cathedral for the glory of God. That's how you think about hope. That's what you're ultimately up to, not just I'm doing menial labor, but God is building something and I'm a part of it. One thing I try to say to those who are preaching sermons, this is the register you want it to be in. There's a whole new world coming, and it's the same as this one, except better. And I don't care if you believe that or not, because it's true. That's, I think, the way to preach. All right, so this is an artist's way of reading the Bible. It's also a scientist's to say that texts don't have one meaning. Great texts have many meanings, and they take on new contexts. It's often not an artist who's the best interpreter of their work. Okay? I mentioned T.S. Eliot earlier. T.S. Eliot's a good artist and a bad critic. You want him creating new things. You don't want him critiquing someone else's thing. To receive a work of art and talk about it is a different skill than to create something new, right? In the physical world, we've often reduced causality to one thing. In philosophy classes, they'll use this example. What's the cause of a cup of tea? Someone's drinking tea. I see teacups in here. There's some Britishness in the British Columbia. What's the cause of it? Generally, we think in scientific terms. You got to heat water to this thing. You got to put leaves in it. But that's not the cause. It's not the only cause. It's also my hands were cold. I was sleepy. I was hosting somebody. I wanted to have a conversation that lasted. I wanted to be kind to my guest. There's all kinds of causes. And you wouldn't want to say, no, it's only one of those things. It's only the physical ones. It's molecules. Yeah, it's molecules, but it's all those other things, human things as well. So this richer and older way of talking about the Bible suggests that there's depths in how you talk about it. There's no one right thing. There can be some wrong things to say. Someone wise said that poets don't go mad, chess players do. Trying to just operate on the level of logic is a way to be less than human. Not everything is logic. So some examples of reading this way in action. This is an icon that, anyone familiar with this? You seen this before? So this was drawn by a Trappistine sister in Iowa. She was doodling during the chapter meeting, bored with what the abbess was saying. It sounded like real life, right? And the sister beside her said, hey, you should show that off. It's really good. And she was like, nah. And they made it their Christmas card that year. So what's happening here is in Christian imagination, drawing on the book of Romans, what Christ is Adam done right this time. Christ is a second Adam, repairing everything that's gone wrong with the first Adam. And so wondering about that, the church has also said, well, then Mary is Eve done right this time. She's making everything right that we humans have made wrong. So what do you see in that image? What jumps out at you? Not a rhetorical question.
Stomping the serpent.
Oh, you went right to the nettle. That's great. Yeah. So what that is an echo of a passage in Genesis 3 that when the punishments are doled out after the fall, the one to the serpent, what's said to the serpent is, you will live in enmity with your offspring and hers. You will strike her heel and she will crush your head. And the church has taken that as a first glimpse of the gospel, that evil will have its head crushed, finally. Now, what I love about it is every multitasking mom can relate. She's not even looking at this snake that she's crushing with her bare feet, right? Snake, I can handle that, right? But it's a sign of what Christians think happens in Jesus, that evil is destroyed, right? Great, good. What else do you see?
The two hands on the woman's son.
Good. What do you make of that? Good observation. It's important. There's hope. Good. Something good coming out. Good.
I just see togetherness.
Togetherness? Yeah, they're doing this sort of middle school slow dance thing, right? I mean, they're a little distance, little togetherness, but they make a composite together, don't they?
But they look like they could be, they're not that much older than
Right.
one another.
Right.
So it's
Good. What's Eve holding? Yeah. She's got the apple, right. So she's still holding on to the source of her own misery, right? I mean, it's a good image for lots of people who struggle with addiction or whatever, right? You know the thing that's making you miserable and you can't set it down, right? But then what Mary's doing with the hand is she's moving Eve's hand to her womb and saying, hey, without you, this gift wouldn't have come. It's a taking away of shame. If Eve is filled with shame, Mary's saying, no, actually, the worst thing you could have ever done brought about the best thing God could do. Like, shame is done. It's not around anymore. It's been exploded by this pregnancy. One thing I love about this image is it's this apocryphal meeting between these two women thousands of years apart, highly legendary, et cetera. But there's no boys present, right? Except the one Mary's busily growing, right? Sidelined mightily. What else you see?
her hair drapes her
Good.
naked body.
Yeah, it took. I taught with this image for years before I recognized that that's her hair. So part of what's happening there is medieval imagery of Mary Magdalene usually depicted her as nude, but her long hair is covering herself. And so it kind of runs together images of Mary Magdalene with desert monastics, lots of whom would live in the nude. And so God has some other way to kind of cover their shame, right? But it makes her look wild anyway, doesn't it? Yeah. So Donatello has this famous depiction of Mary Magdalene that's in Florence, that's where she's depicted like that. Now look, this is what art's supposed to do. It's supposed to make you wonder out loud, faithfully, right? And there's not just one way to look at it, but then once we've come to here's what we think it's about, someone else can say, no, it's not about that at all. Here's this other reading. And if it comports with the image on the page, the rest of us will be like, oh, wow, you're right. I didn't see that before. So the sister who drew this icon, I had her into my class via Zoom. And people were asking her about, what's the fruit? And why is all the and she finally said, I'm not answering those questions. I'm done. And now you get to interpret it. That's good, right? Okay. Let's see. Now, in Christian imagination, Mary is not some sort of one-off. She's the first one filled with the physical presence of God, but she's also a prototype. Everybody else is invited to be filled with the physical presence of God in an analogous way. You and I are also called to sainthood. This is also true of all creation. It's not just true of human beings. All of it is filled with the physical presence of God. There's a Jewish midrashic teaching that every blade of grass has an angel assigned to it who whispers, grow, grow. Creation's filled with things we can't see with our physical eyes. I'm convinced that this way of viewing creation is correct. And once you don't have it anymore, there's no reason not to destroy creation. Just call it nature and treat it like a commodity and use it up, right? But if you think it's a thing that reveals the glory of God, you'll love it and defend it and get to know it and treasure it and make it healthier, right? So, another example. I teach a lot with St. Augustine, who I mentioned earlier, and he's interpreting Psalm 102. Now, Psalm 102 is a lament psalm, reads really well in times of disaster. It read really well after 9/11 in my own U.S. It's a description of Jerusalem as so desolate, no humans are there. The only animals are there are animals who don't like company. Your coyotes would do really well in Psalm 102's Jerusalem. And Psalm 102 specifically mentions owls. Owls are really happy in abandoned Jerusalem. So 102:6 says this. Isn't that a cute owl? That's a good owl right there. I have become like an owl in desolate places. But Augustine's version mistranslates and has that bird as a pelican. Now, he has never seen a pelican. They don't live in his part of the world, so he has to do a little research. And he finds out in Roman zoology and biology, they say that mother pelicans they do this. They kill their own young in the nest, and then they wound themselves and pour their blood out on their young, and their young survive. They revive. Most parents can relate to this. Parenting involves blood, right? Like, way more often than we would like. Now, Augustine is skeptical about the biology. He basically says, nah, I've seen a lot of birds, and they've never done anything like that. But he then says, if the story is true or were true, what a perfect image for Christ. Observe how apt a symbol it is of him who gave life by his blood. God slays her young in the nest, then wounds herself, pours out her blood, and revives them. So scholars sometimes point out, Augustine's not always great news on gender, but a lot of his metaphors become quite feminine, almost despite himself, okay? So what happens is after Augustine hatches that image of Jesus from Psalm 102 with the pelican, that becomes a Christ image in the whole rest of the Christian church's history. So almost any cathedral you go to in the world, there'll be a pelican in there somewhere. It's a symbol of Jesus, right? Thomas Aquinas prays to Jesus as our pelican divine. Now, this is how this is supposed to work. I was teaching away about this pelican thing at a seminary outside Chicago, and the students start giggling. And I was like, what's wrong with y'all, right? Let me have some of whatever you're passing around. And they say, don't you, see the pelican every day? And sure enough, on my way into seminary, I had been missing, my reveal is being slowed down by the slow clicker. I had been missing a sculpture of a mother pelican with her young. It was way up high, so I didn't see it. All you could see was the mother with the wings out and little beaks poking up. It was an image for Christ on the way in and out of the building every day. So they already knew about this Christ symbol. I didn't need to sell it to them. Someone had pointed it out, and they were seeing it all the time. More momentous occasion. I was getting ready to ask my now wife to marry me. There was no mystery in this. We'd bought the ring together. We knew what was coming. We knew we were going to go get engaged to one another. But, all the wine was drunk, all the stories were told, and I was terrified because, boys, commitment issues. It's pathetic. And what do I see but a flock of pelicans? Now, that's either a coincidence, in which case I wish you a boring life, or it's Jesus saying everything that's good is also hard, and that doesn't make it not good, right? Now, here's how this is supposed to work. The next time you see a pelican, who are you going to think of but a certain rabbi from Nazareth? And a little bit of creation is made transparent to the one who makes it and redeems it in Christ. Pelicans have new meaning now they didn't have before. You see that? Now, it's not the final meaning. It's not the only meaning. It can keep heaping meaning up on pelicans. Some of them are bad. The New Orleans Pelicans NBA team is called that because it was a French colony, and the pelican became a symbol of French colonialism. It's not that it's altogether good, right? Symbols can do harm. And so use symbols in a way that bless your neighbors rather than do harm. Okay, That boring life thing comes from Barbara Brown Taylor. It's too good a line to not footnote it. All right. Another example of this, William Blake, one time in a poem, objects to someone who asks if a sunrise reminds him of a coin, and says this instead: "What do you see when the sun rises? A ball of fire about the size of a coin? Oh no, I see the whole heavenly host shouting, 'Holy, holy, holy.'" The ball of fire in the sun, the fusion reactor that keeps us alive, is for Blake a reminder of the Eucharist, the Lord's Supper, that fiery presence of God that gives life, but also death, right? Here's the point. Creation is chock full of its creator, and it takes a lot for us to stop seeing it, but we have stopped seeing it. And so I love that our medieval forebears were pretty good at seeing that. Often these kind of animal interpretations get made fun of in the history of kind of Christian theology. I always think they're amazing. I never get enough of them. Because even though it's based on a wrong piece of biological teaching and a mistranslation, it's more right than most of our correct translations, okay? Because it's filled with life, and it's connected to creation. All right, another example, better biology this time, sort of. A very ancient image for Christ's transfiguration in the church is, timing, a peacock. Previous religions before Christianity had also revered the peacock. There were legends that peacock flesh didn't decay, and so they became signs of immortality. Y'all know that show Manifest? It's not very good, but the peacock is in there for that reason. I mean, the peacock's good, but the show's less good. All right, so in the church, it became a sign of Christ's divinity. Now, here's what I love about these pre-Christian, non-Christian legends. No one is ever surprised when stories get kind of subsumed into the church, because God's generous. God has left bits of wisdom everywhere, right? And so we're never surprised when some people has like something close to the heart of things. And we say, that's something God's left for us in these friends who've taught us this story. When truth comes in person, all of the like bits of truth are sort of like iron filings attracted to a magnet. So in the story of the Transfiguration, Christ goes away from his ordinary self and comes back. Well, he doesn't go away. He changes to a form that dazzles, right? The disciples look away. Moses and Elijah appear to speak with him. A voice booms from heaven. I remember when I first learned of this, it's from Flannery O'Connor, the Southern short story writer, who in one of her stories describes what happens this way. The priest let his eyes wander toward the birds. They had reached the middle of the lawn. The cock stopped suddenly, and with it curving its neck backwards, he raised his tail and spread it with a shimmering timbrous noise. I've been looking for excuses to use that word timbrous ever since. It's kind of hard. Tears of small pregnant suns floated in the green gold haze over his head. The priest stood transfixed, his jaw slack. Mrs. McIntyre wondered where she had ever seen such an idiotic old man. "Christ will come like that," he said in a loud, gay voice, and wiped his hand over his mouth and stood there, gaping. The old man didn't seem to hear her objection. His attention was fixed on the cock, who was taking minute steps backwards, his head against spread tail. "The Transfiguration," he murmured. "He came to redeem us," and blandly reached for her hand and shook it and said he must go. So peacocks have long been a sign of Christ in Christian imagination because they transform from an already beautiful bird. I mean, that's a beautiful bird anyway, to an unimaginable one. And the church has said that's what Christ is doing to every creature, transfiguring us from beauty into unimaginable beauty. The priest who can see this looks like a fool in the other person's eyes. That ought to be us when we interpret the Bible well, because we can see something someone else can't see. Often in biblical interpretation, done by people like me with degrees, the last thing we want is to look foolish. That's what academia is for, is to make us terrified of looking foolish. But actually, if you're going to tell the truth, you're more likely to look foolish than you are to look dignified, okay? It's a good sign of something good going on. Once you see that about the peacock, you can't unsee it. Now, the argument would go, this is what happens with regard to Christ and creation, that without him, it's just nature that you can be disposed of. But with Jesus, creation is resplendent, incandescent. And again, when we fail to see it this way, it's just a commodity you can use up. So if creation is the theater of God's glory, and the only means to discern Christ is to look hard at physical things until you see them transfigured, you'll treat it differently. And I think this is the way Bible interpretation works and the interpretation of creation works. You're working hard to see Jesus somewhere unexpected and surprising, okay? Now again, this is how this works. I was in Victoria, went to Beacon Hill Park. There are peacocks everywhere, sauntering around like they own the place. They were even cooler than in the photos, right? I mean, I'd seen them before, but were they this cool before? I guess. I just wasn't looking. But now I was looking. You see what I mean? Flannery O'Connor passes on a description of peacocks as the king of the birds. It's not a bad sign that Christ reigns there. And not just that he reigns, but that he reigns with such beauty. I only learned this getting ready for this talk this time. There can be albino peacocks. This is how creation works. It goes from beautiful to oh wow, right? And that doesn't have to stop. There's another gear in everything in creation, okay? All right, I got more examples and more things to say, but I think you're catching the drift of what I'm trying to get across. So why don't I stop there and ask for questions, pushback, amendment to the minutes? What do you think? I gotta get better at the dismount. Like in church, you can say amen and everyone knows it's over, but it's not church.
Amen to all of that.
Thanks.
Sorry, this is a really pondering question, and since you talked about the reconciliation walk, it kind of is really triggering for
Yes.
me, right? Because when we talk about residential schools
Right.
and you're trying to, talking, those children really never had the opportunity
Right.
to know the Bible or read the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
It was this is what the Bible said, and this is, so it was
Right.
used in that sense. So as we work towards truth and reconciliation and healing,
Mm-hmm.
how would you suggest we move through this?
Read the Bible more like this.
Yeah, I know, but
here's
how,
why.
Yeah,
Here's why. Indigenous people know that creation is full of creator. Mm-hmm. It took white Europeans to come along and say, no, none of these things mean that. None of these stories are real. This is all legendary stuff. You have to pay attention to science for truth. But indigenous people have never lost a sense of the magic of creation that the rest of us are trying to relearn, right? So I actually think this way of reading pushes us closer to our Jewish neighbors, whom we've often mistreated, and to our indigenous neighbors, who we've often mistreated, right? That it's really a myopic white European thing to say that nature doesn't mean anything, and so you can destroy it. So I'm actually really hopeful about this way of reading with that regard. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks. We had our convocation at VST last night, and the really good speaker was going on a little long. And my indigenous colleague is over here with his drum, ready to do the drumming thing next. And my other indigenous colleague is beside me over here with his drum, ready to drum next. And I was like, guys, y'all can just kind of start. It's probably time to finish this talk up, right? But both indigenous peoples and my guy Augustine talk about the drum as an image for Christ. It's skin stretched out, dried, devoid of moisture, that then gives beauty and life. It's not wrong to call it magic, right? I guess in the church we might call it miraculous. Anyway. Thanks for that. Some of you guys seemed puzzled when I was mentioning Rocha, so I don't guess everybody knows what Rocha is. So Rocha is a Christian environmentalist organization that's in 22 countries. Basically it's evangelicals who are learning to care for their created environment because they catch a vision like this. So Rocha, Canada is not far away from here, and I love this story. Leah and Marku Costomo tell this story so well. They have interns who go there, they farm, they have CSAs, they have school kids that come out to the farm there on the premise that you can't defend something you don't love. So if most of us spend our time in malls, they want more of us to spend our time in dirt. And it's beautiful. Some years ago, they had been guarding this watershed of the Little Campbell River for some time, and they had a college intern who was praying that morning, standard evangelical quiet time. And she felt the Lord say to her, you're gonna see something amazing today. This sounds like a cheesy story, because it is. And so she's with a group of tourists, and she goes to pull up the bucket out of the river to show them whatever the wildlife is in the bucket. And she hears the Holy Spirit say, "Are you ready for your amazing thing?" She pulls it up, and what's in there is a Salish sucker, which is a fish that had been thought extinct from this watershed. And this college kid showed it was not only not extinct, it could live in the Little Campbell River again. So Rocha, Canada got on the map of environmentalists and other organizations trying to study species that come back to places where they should be dead. Now that's a resurrection story, but it's also an environmental win. Like, we need more of both of those things. And so the sort of fable that says that religious people don't care about the environment, which is one that's been pushed by really wealthy people for their own corporate interests, is false. Rocha is one of those places that's trying to grow to show its falsehood, and may its tribe increase. So it's present in Canada. We graduated a student at VST last night from Lebanon. Rocha's in Lebanon, taking care of a wetland that's one of the only wetlands in that entire country, and it's in 20 other places, doing good work. So there's that. Leah, who helped found it, and Margaret Atwood have become friends. So somebody put them on TV together and said, well, here's Margaret Atwood, Canada's great living author, who writes about end-of-the-world evangelical sectarians. And here's Leah Costomo, who's an end-of-the-world evangelical sectarian. Okay, you two discuss amongst yourselves. And so Margaret Atwood, who grew up in the United Church but isn't particularly religious now, says, we need religion. I don't believe in it, but we need it, and we need it this kind. More like this. So she's become an evangelist for like a faith that's not hers. Like, that's interesting to me. So, all right, what else about peacocks and pelicans and Mary and whatnot? Please.
Just a comment, actually. I'm thinking about having taught young kids for many years. Oh, you want this?
People
Having
online
taught many
can't
kids.
hear you. Yeah.
Oh,
otherwise.
okay.
Yeah.
Sorry. Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Having taught young kids for many years, I find unless I've missed a whole bunch of great books, there's just not enough out there for young
Right.
kids to story them in this way, in the beauty
Yeah.
way. It's,
Yeah.
I mean, I'm from a generation of a lot of the moralistic stories, like
Right.
Dare to be a Daniel, We kind of missed a lot of,
Totally.
You got to be like Moses, you got to have courage and whatnot. And yeah.
Right. Right.
Anyways, it's just a comment. We
It's
need
a really
more.
good
We
way
need
to-
more books out
Yeah.
there to story young
Yeah.
kids.
It's a really good way to bore kids, right? Like, you must do the following. No one cares, right? What I'd rather, Betty's work over here has a whole thing on the dragonfly, which has a whole other set of kind of Christian stories behind it. And again, I think the way to do this is, amazing creatures like that collect stories. They accrue to them, right? And so then you share stories with other peoples who have cool stories about them too, right? And eventually, as a Christian, you say, here's how for us this means God has a spleen and a Jewish mom. I know that's super weird, but that's what we believe. Is there a pelican in there? Amazing, I missed the pelican. Yeah, pelican's kind of my thing. Like, I got it in stained glass in my office, so it's pretty thick of me to have missed that in Betty. That's great.
John Philip Newell talks about the early Celtic tradition as having a more rich and robust love for the created world, and it's embedded in their song, in their liturgies, and what have you. Where did we lose?
Yeah.
Where did we start going off the track? And
I'm a little skeptical of the Celtic claim, because I think what actually happens with the Celts is they do like the desert mothers and fathers do. They go as far away from everybody else as they can get, where their companions are scary creatures. It's a little bit like Christ going into the wilderness and the wild beasts were with him, right? But in what's now Scotland and Ireland and whatever, those tend to be islands rather than desert. And those islands have fish and there's seals, and you're not eating, so you see stuff, and they're whales, and they terrify you, right? So it's not so much that Celtic Christianity was better. That's often the claim that's being hustled in that regard. I'm no good at kind of figuring out why this all went awry. I mean, like what went wrong with Western civilization, right? Like Gandhi said that would be a good idea, Western civilization, right? I do think at some point, so there is this sociological thesis associated with Max Weber that says what happens in the Enlightenment and in modernity is that the world is disenchanted. that pre-modern peoples have an enchanted universe where there are creatures everywhere. There's trolls under bridges, there's fairies, and most peoples have stories like that, right? What happens in our strange parochial place is that all those stories are thrown out, really overnight, and you're not allowed to tell them in educated company anymore, right? There's big debates on how accurate that is. I think it's true, and so a large part of what I'm trying to get my preaching students to do is to re-enchant the world. The world was never disenchanted. We learned how to see it wrong, right? We became blind in how we looked at it. So I want people to hear sermons that have them treat the world as the miracle it is, and treat other people as the miracle they are, right? That's the other thing is the world being a kind of resource you can use up is not a long step to other people being a resource to use up, right? And we've treated them that way.
Yeah, which little children still have. If I look at our granddaughters who can wander through our gardens and still see all the magic and the little doors and the little places where creatures are hidden. And
I mean, it's amazing to me that like in my world, the seminary world, we've still got biblical interpretation that's like, you got to make it make sense. It's got to be rational. And meanwhile, you've got like Harry Potter and Star Wars and like Lord of the Rings, and like people actually want big, beautiful stories, and they're not like, that can't happen. I don't think you understand what a story is at that point, right? So the sort of stuffing all the mythology back into our storytelling is part of what I'm after there. Yeah.
Which Flannery O'Connor does really well in a pretty wild way. Yeah.
Right. So Flannery O'Connor, in my experience, most Canadians haven't read. O'Connor is a very traditionalist Catholic who most of her stories deal with conversion, and people don't usually get converted without being killed. By the end of her life, she figures out how to convert someone without murdering them. So it's serious for her. Like, the stakes are high.
Yeah.
And usually nature's involved in some remarkable way, right?
Yeah.
So.
Anyone else? Comment, a question, a thought?
I feel like I've bludgeoned you into submission here.
I think the art thing you should talk about, because you talked about how it should be beautiful. And,
Right.
And as an artist, sometimes my art isn't.
Sorry, I just don't want to be a mic hog, but I think art is interpretation, and sometimes we have to work through our art, and sometimes it's ugly.
Right.
It isn't beautiful.
Yeah, I mean, questions of aesthetics are contentious, right? I mean, this is what we started to talk about early on. And so to trot beauty out as though it's an unproblematic territory is a mistake on my part. And yet, it is one of those areas where, I mean, Charles Taylor's written the big book on secularism and what it is. And he points out one place you can still catch strangers approaching something with reverence is in places where there's art. Quiet in front of it, sit down in front of it, contemplate. And that's how it's supposed to work. Right? So, like noticing a sort of creation denuded of mystery that's actually still flush with mystery, we just don't see it. I want to treat aesthetics as a thing that actually people kind of naturally have and have to be kind of fooled into thinking they don't have. Part of it is whenever we were taught, if you're going to draw something, it has to be like right? I still think I'm a terrible artist. I am. Because, like, I would draw something and, like, no, it's not right. No, like, keep drawing, right? And it's the same way with music in our culture. We think you have to be, like, professional quality and paid for it to be worth doing. Why did we think that? No, you just make noise and other people join in and holler with you. Like, it's human to do that. Anyway, did you want to say something about the beauty business? Because you and I had this little quick exchange, or... You're a professional beauty maker, so, you know.
Actually... I'll just add that I've, as an artist, gone through this phase of making work that is beautiful on purpose, because, commercialism. And I've actually come around to rejecting it, which is why I'm doing these pieces that you cannot buy. They cannot be owned. They're experiential. So it's more about creating an embodied experience instead of taking something home and hanging it on your wall and privately enjoying it. So I'm kind of an oddball to comment here because it's not a common art practice to do.
Yeah. That's
but
really
I've definitely
lovely.
come full circle myself.
Yeah.
And I'll just add, like, my work is, I'm always thinking about sort of the opposite of what is expected.
Yeah.
So using that as a direction.
The rest of us need that from you artists, right? Like, the world's crazy, so we need somebody to help us see it upside down. Thank you for that. I mean, Betty's work has Picasso's Guernica all throughout it, right? Which is a depiction of violence against civilians in the Spanish Civil War. That's a horrifying thing. It's not beautiful at all. The artwork is, weirdly, so beautiful that it changed our notions of beauty, right? I mean, even the Pietà that I showed you is beautiful as an image of a horrifying thing, a mother holding her dead child. Like, you lose that because it's so glorious, right? So anyway, the categories don't sit still. They move around, and they should be contentious, right? That's lovely. Bless you. Thanks for letting me put you on the spot. Professor trick. Speaking of which, Allison, what do you think? I haven't actually taught
Allison. I taught Allison first, so if it really went bad since then, it was great before.
Well, Jason hasn't technically taught me
I have
yet,
not.
although I am enrolled in a class in the fall. So
Oh, good.
This should be fun. I might
Do
be
the
able
reading.
to have
Yeah.
some payback then. I think I've been thinking about when you talked about having for preachers to have an effect, to find what they delight in, to not bore people with that, and that the delight is Christ, and there's this rediscovering, this re-enchanting, and you talk about how in general with a North American perspective, I mean that's what I could speak from what I know and grew up in, that you have to defy a lot of things with that, because there's an element of almost like productivity that's bred into stuff, and I think it's led to very poor understandings of like dominionism and that sort of stuff, where we feel that there is an entitlement to use up creation, and that everything should have some sort of value in what it can produce rather than value in existence. And I think that there is something to be said for relearning how to engage with creation and engaging with it not from a perspective of productivity or what can be gained from it, but rather just a wonder, a delight in the existence of it.
Good. So, I mean, this would be the danger of my view, right? Which would be, okay, if you don't discern Christ in creation, it doesn't necessarily have value. That would be a comeback to me, right? To which I would say, what?
I don't think it's my perspective to force how the divine is revealed to me onto other people.
Sure. Great.
That I don't.
Totally
I think that the divine revelation isn't my responsibility. I think that's the responsibility of God. And so I wouldn't presume that somebody, just because they don't see what I see, it doesn't change it for me. And I don't get to interpret that for them. I think there are people who would struggle with that.
Yeah.
And from my own personal perspective, I would think that some of the fault with that does lie with things like what Charles Taylor identifies, like the disenchantment, the secularization, that there is a struggle, there's almost a relearning that we have to do.
Right. So one thing I find in myself is a move that wants to use the word just in an unhelpful way. Oh, that's just an owl. Or that's just a peacock. Nothing is just anything, right? Everything is amazing. So the other day when I was here, I think it was Jenny read the Mary Oliver poem about your one wild and precious life. And I had forgotten the business about holding the grasshopper that's eating sugar out of her hand and the jaws moving back and forth and so on. She's not rushing to find Jesus in that. She's just loving watching the little thing eat and feeling it move, right? And that's good enough. It's not somehow invalid or not Christian. No, it's just beautiful, right? So one reason I love this way of interpreting is it says there's always multiple interpretations. Peacock can be a peacock, and it can be Jesus, and it can be a bird that other people interpret other ways, and it can be a sign that the whole world's going to be transfigured, and other people will read something different, right? There's not a right answer someone gets to impose, and that often has been the church, right? So, yeah.
Well, thank you very much. As the light goes from the sky, our own barn owl will be perching out on the ledge there, and we'll go hunting for the night. And it's mysterious and awesome, actually. And probably in a few weeks, the owlets will hatch. They are fearsome, ugly little birds that are created in a way that I guess helps them survive. Yeah. They put out a sound like the Nazgul in Lord of the Rings.
It's the loudest thing you've ever heard.
It's like, it's terrifying and beautiful. Yeah. But thank you for bringing us to that place again this evening. And
can I ask you an owl question?
I'll try.
Is a group of owls really a parliament of owls? I've read this.
That's nice, yeah. Is it a Canadian parliament or an Australian parliament?
Talk about words we should use more often.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you so much. Thanks, and thank you for joining us. There's coffee and tea and wine and beer and conversation to be had at McCabe's just across the way, or come back up here and enjoy Betty's work for a while if you'd like. But thanks very much. And next event is Saturday at 10 a.m.